Hello and welcome to part 2 of my Lords of Midnight series about writing this book that I've embarked on. In the second episode I sort of wanted to concentrate a little bit on the origin of the whole writing this book thing, some of the challenges involved in writing it, and also some of the pitfalls and things I've had to overcome and deal with in the process of writing this book. So obviously that all goes back to 1984. And the genesis of this whole thing back in the day when Mike Singleton put it all together. So and he did it all in 8 months, which is quite impressive, really. That's the game, the graphics, the testing, I assume, and writing the novellas and writing the manual, and pretty much, as far as I can tell, almost entirely bug-free from a piece of software, which is a remarkable achievement. Even today, and he did it all again the following year in Doomdark's Revenge. So obviously a bit of a genius, far more so than I. It's taken me almost 2 years to get this book together, and that's just writing a book. So I haven't had to do any programming or anything like that. So hats off to Mike Singleton. I wish I could have met him actually. He, as you're probably aware, he died in 2012, which was very sad. I never got to meet him in person, but having spoken to a few people who did know him, I'm quite you kind of get a sense of the guy, in the sense that he was a storyteller and had a whole bunch of stories that he wanted to get out, partly in the games, and he actually wanted to write the official Lords of Midnight book, and unfortunately never got around to it, for all sorts of reasons. He was always telling the next story, I guess, in some ways, and never got to go back to Midnight, having created it all those years ago. It's very sad that I never got to meet him, but I would have loved to. I got to meet a few of my other kind of inspirational people. I got to meet David Braben from the Worlds of Elite, and I got to meet Carl Sagan from the world of astronomy, if you're familiar with him, and also Patrick Moore. I actually even got invited to his house, which was quite cool. Got to play with one of his telescopes. Completely eccentric chap, but very, very interesting person to talk to. And So they say don't meet your heroes, but I've managed to meet quite a lot of mine, and they're not perfect, obviously, but they're interesting people in real life as well. So if you get a chance to meet your heroes, sometimes it's worth taking it. I found mine pretty interesting, so there you go. But anyway, as per usual, digressing. Going back to this book, so why would you write a book based on a 1984 novel, 1984 computer game? Well, I've kind of been there, done that already, as you know, but it's almost a sort of sense of unfinished business, I think. Lords of Midnight, the game, had a competition when it came out back in 1984, and by its publisher Beyond, and the prize there was to have a book written about your exploits in the game. And the idea was that the lucky player, some youngster from those days, would play the game and presumably print out scene by scene on rolls of ZX thermal printer paper their exploits in the game through until hopefully they won. And it must have been incredibly gutting if you printed out thousands and thousands of these things and then you got killed by wolves or something in the last closing moments of the game. So how many people tried that? But apparently people did. So, and a winning entry was sent in, and I don't think Beyond expected anybody to actually do this somehow, because they weren't prepared for it, and the offer to get their exploits turned into a book never materialized, and I think they sort of quietly shuffled the winner away and gave him some free copies of some other games, which, to be honest, he was probably more interested in anyway. It was sort of quietly forgotten, and it sort of sat there, over the years as just part of the myth and the story, really, of the background of Lords of Midnight. So that was quite interesting. But I remember playing Lords of Midnight back when I was 13 in 1984. And I remember thinking at the time, it would have been quite good to read a story of this. This is a good game. It lends itself to a story. And I'd not long come off reading The Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings, not surprisingly, at that sort of age. You know, it was a natural thing to get into. You know, those sort of stories were very, very popular around about that time for my generation, and things like you know, the Shannara Chronicles and things like that were books that were around at the time that were the sort of compelling things. And yeah, it made sense that maybe you would have a fantasy story based off a computer game back then, but it never happened, and it kind of slowly went quietly away. Lords of Midnight, Doomdark's Revenge faded into the, you know, the myth and the legend of ZX Spectrum kind of lore, and that was it. And it wasn't until much later on, obviously, that all this sort of stuff happened. So 2 years ago, back in 2016, I was browsing Twitter, as you do, sort of on a Saturday afternoon or whatever it was, and just remember seeing this Doomguard icon from one of the Twitter avatars, and thinking, oh, I recognise that. That's the whoever they are, the bad guys from Lords of Midnight. And I just sort of typed in a tweet saying, oh, hey, I recognise the avatar, Lords of Midnight, isn't it? Yeah, I haven't heard of that for ages. And the guy responded, Tom Fahey, on Twitter, if you're watching, and you know, we struck up this conversation. He said, you know, it was a great game, wasn't it? Yeah, I remember all that, and you know, victory goes to the free, etc. All the kind of catchphrases from the game. And we were chatting for this, and he says, oh, have you checked out the remakes? And I said, remakes? What remakes? I haven't come across any remakes. He said, oh yeah, at Icemark, you need to check this out. So he sent me a link, and I said, oh my god, it's available on Android and iPhone and PC and all sorts of good stuff. So I started checking those out. And then Chris Wilde, of course, who did those remakes and talked for a long, long time with Mike Singleton, basically you know, joined the conversation. And I said, oh yeah, I was writing a book for Elite. Wouldn't it be fun to do one for Lords of Midnight? And then Chris just sort of jumped in the conversation with a kind of absolute, you know, huge bong of suspense. He just put the little phrase, which was, it can be arranged. and that was how it started. So, oh my god, actually, this guy, Chris Wilde, which I know many of you online will know, effectively holds the IP custodianship for Lords of Midnight now, with Mike Singleton having passed on and his family effectively asking him to look after it. So here's the guy who effectively owns the game, and here's a writer who's willing to write this story. So, you know, the first bit around that is basically, okay, Drew's interested in writing, but it's not the first time apparently someone's tried to write a Lord of the Rings book. There have been, it's not Lord of the Rings, Lords of Hack, I'll get that wrong. No, it is Lords of Midnight, I promise. It's not the first time someone's tried to do a Lord of Midnight book. There have been several attempts over the last decade or so, and the impression I've got, and I haven't read any of them, haven't seen any of them, don't know any of the authors who tried it, not very good. So anyway, there we go. So the first question I think Chris was having in his mind, okay, well, if someone's willing to write a book, that's great, but can they actually write? So fortunately for me, I had a few credentials, the Elite stuff obviously that you all know about, and I've written some of my own sci-fi sort of stroke fantasy series, as you know, in the Shadewood saga, so at least I had something to point at. But Chris set me a few hoops to jump through, and the first one of this was write me a prologue. So write me an intro to the story, and also write me a kind of plot summary of how you see the book of the Lords of Midnight actually transpiring. So is it a book that is set in the Lords of Midnight, kind of a story that's tangential, if you like, to the kind of classic gameplay? Does it focus on just a subset of characters, or does it focus on the whole thing? So I was thinking about this, thinking, well, actually, I'd kind of like to go back and finish that Beyond competition. I'd like to write the book of the game. The story that I eventually put together is based on sort of gameplay that most people would recognise, having played Lords of Midnight back in 1984, and I wanted to do that. And there's two aspects, as I covered yesterday, which is the quest aspect, with Morkin going off to destroy the Ice Crown, and then there's the battle aspect and the various different places that you can try and force Doomdark to, you know, not kill you, basically. So you've got battles on the Plains of Blood, and, you know, recruiting all the lords, and you've got Rothron doing his thing, and the various other characters around Midnight. So those are all the things I thought, well, I want a plot that actually put all of that stuff in a book. I want to read the entire story of Lords of Midnight. So I want to basically go into the book, kind of play the game, and then get to the end of the game, which we kind of know what happens, but I want to encapsulate that entire story in a book. So that was the objective. I said that to Chris. He kind of went, sounds great, sounds ambitious. Hey, always like a challenge. You know, can you write me a prologue? So I thought, well, that's completely fair. So I wrote a prologue. I think it's about 20 pages. Now he wanted to take that to Mike Singleton's family, which again, completely fair enough. And he wanted to kind of test me out. You know, A, was I up for it really? B, was what I was going to come up with appropriate? Did it match him with the sort of style and the feel of Lords of Midnight? Because a lot of that had been established partly by the game and partly by the novellas that Mike Singleton wrote. So they were quite stylized. They're a bit 80s, not surprisingly. But actually, Mike, being an English teacher, was actually quite a reasonable writer. You know, there's nothing wrong with what he wrote at all. Those novellas, if you read them today, still stand up absolutely fine as a piece of kind of 80s, 90s fantasy. Absolutely nothing wrong with them at all. And so given that precedent had been set, the book I didn't feel anyway, couldn't deviate too far away from, you know, what had already been established. So you know, so that's the approach I took. I wrote the prologue, edited it a bit to try and get all the typos out, and then sent it off. And so that was my, if you like, my application letter to see if I could kind of audition almost, I suppose, to write this book. Because I think Chris was very concerned that he wanted something that did justice to you know, the Lords of Midnight kind of lore, the experience of playing the game, and also the grandeur. And I know that sounds like a strange word to use for an old computer game, but Lords of Midnight had a certain mystique about it, a certain, quite sure the right word, grandure's close to it anyway, and it took itself very seriously. It didn't muck about. It used proper words. It was very self-contained and yet very well articulated, I think. The example I always use is the use of the word invigorated, which I must admit I had to look up at school because I didn't know what it meant back in 1984. And then when I realised what it meant, I thought, well, that's perfect. You know, rather than the kind of classic stuff you have on computer games at the time, which would be a little health bar or a percentage, he used the word invigorated to mean that you were fully, you know, healthy, and then you'd be utterly tired at the extreme end and unable to move. So, you know, that was good. That kind of added a sort of essence to the game, which was that much more than anything else had at the time. So all those elements had to come into play. Fortunately, Chris liked the prologue, kind of liked where I was going with the plot, and you know, yes, I spoke to my publisher about it. They were quite excited, and you know, then I was off. So we started writing the book. But, and here's the issue. Here's the big issue. The first big issue in it. We did have a problem, and the problem is this. And you've probably come across this. The Lord of the Rings by a certain Mr. J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, the problem with this is J.R.R. Tolkien, he's not necessarily the first person to have ever written a fantasy novel, you know, with witches and warlocks and dwarfs and elves and so on and so forth, but he's probably by far the biggest name that there ever has been and probably ever will be in the realms of fantasy. If you think dragons and you think you know, dark forces, and you think elves and dwarves and, you know, orcs and so on and so forth and goblins, then you generally think Tolkien. Now, as you know, and I don't really need to do a plot summary of Lord of the Rings, but you know there's a magic ring which makes you invisible, but there's also actually the source of all sort of evil power that Sauron, the Dark Lord, created. He's planning to cast all the lands into complete darkness and subdue everybody. There's a desperate quest by 4 hobbits, Frodo among them, who carries the ring. There are various lords about, so you have the revealed Lord Aragorn, King of Gondor, and who starts off as a ranger without kind of merit to, you know, in that sort of event, and then he becomes the King of Gondor later on. You have various different characters in there. You have people who assist on the quest. You have some very, very large battles, you know, Battle of Helm's Deep and the Plenna Fields. You know, we all know what that story looks like. And if we're a bit unkind to Lords of Midnight, it's a little bit of a pastiche of this book. So if I can draw some parallels between our wonderful Midnight and these books here, is that we have a desperate quest. So we have a kind of chosen one in Morkin, who is obviously a little bit of an analogy of Frodo in some ways. We have Gandalf the Grey in Lord of the Rings, and we have Rothron the Wise in Lords of Midnight, who does look suspiciously wizardy, even though he's not actually ever called out as a wizard in Lords of Midnight. We have Corleth the Fey, who does remind me a little bit of Legolas the Elf. And we have Luxor the Moon Prince, who's a chap who doesn't originally understand his ancestry and then discovers he's a Moon Prince, which is rather similar to Aragorn discovering that he's King of Gondor. And we have an evil, desperate quest against an ultimate baddie who's trying to cast the lands into everlasting winter and subdue them, in the case of Doomdark, which isn't all that distinct from Sauron, who's trying to cast the lands into everlasting darkness and subdue them, but at least there's no snow. We've got alternative wizards hanging about, so we have in Lord of the Rings we have Saruman of many colours, or Saruman the White as he starts off, and of course we have Lorgrim as well in Lords of Midnight as another wizard who's out there. And desperate battles, big citadels, obviously minus Tirith in Lord of the Rings, and we have places like, and I still can't pronounce this right, Chris Wilde has already told me how to pronounce this and I've forgotten, and I can't remember now, so I'm going to get it wrong. So anyway, I call it Zadjikith because that's what they called it when I was a kid. I know it's wrong, but I can't remember what the correct pronunciation is. And probably Luxor as well. I call them Luxor. I think a lot of people call him Luxor, but I find Luxor sort of, I don't know, it works for me. That's what I used to say. So apologies for any of the pronunciations throughout. So that is, from a writing perspective, a bit of a problem, because a lot of fantasy that was written in the 80s and 90s was very much a pastiche of Lord of the Rings. And I didn't really want to kind of do that again, because it's a bit derivative and it's a bit, kind of been there, done that. And Lords of Midnight does deserve something better, but the problem is I can't just trash the existing lore of Lords of Midnight in order to do something radically different, because we have a Moon Prince, we have Morkin, we have all those characters. They've clearly got to be there, and they've got to do the things that they did in the game, because that is the essence of Lords of Midnight. So the trick is there. Well, what is different in Lords of Midnight that differentiates it from Lord of the Rings, that we can actually emphasise and work on? So that was a big part of looking at the plot, going, can we get away from Lord of the Rings and not kind of go there? And so the way we avoided that was to look through the lore of Lords of Midnight and the subsequent games that were around, and some of Mike Singleton's kind of pencil notes and plans for what he thought could occur later on. There are a lot of other lands around Midnight. So obviously to the northeast you have the Ice Mark, which is the subject of the second game, and you have quite a lot of stuff going on up there, obviously, that we know about, but there are other lands besides, and we know to the south and the southeast there's the Blood March, and there's quite a bit of small bits of lore in some of the other novellas that you can kind of string together to pull out things. So what we're trying to do actually was, Lords of Midnight obviously is quite similar in many respects to Lord of the Rings in overall kind of high level view, but when you combine it with things like Doomdark's Revenge and Eye of the Moon and some of the other stuff that's going on, it becomes a different type of story. And we've tried to take elements of that and weave them into the Lords of Midnight story in order to partly differentiate, but partly give us opportunities to go off and do other things. So Lords of Midnight is probably, and I hope, is the first of at least 3 books that we could potentially set in this kind of realm. So we've tried to use that lore to make things a little bit more expansive, differentiate ourselves a little bit from Lord of the Rings, and write something that's new. So I've deliberately completely ignored anything that's been going on in the Lord of the Rings story when I was writing Lords of Midnight. I tried to kind of exercise it from my from my brain as much as I could. There are some places where simply it's inevitable that people will go Lord of the Rings, because the story in some aspects is literally just too similar. I've tried to keep that to a minimum. But when you've got a desperate quest and an epic battle with kind of swords and sorcery type stuff going on, you know, that's quite hard to do. So you're going to have to forgive me on some of that, because so if you've seen the books or read the films, you know, they'll be in your mind inevitably. It's impossible to write fantasy now without kind of being influenced by Lord of the Rings. So kind of acknowledge that, put it to one side, and then try to write the story. But what I've also done is I've gone back and played the game several times to kind of get myself back into the mindset. And it's amazing what you actually forget about playing these games. There's quite a lot of things. Oh yeah, of course he did that, and this happens. So there's lots of little things in there, like the fact that certain characters can hide. There's lots of little things, like occasionally you'll be just tromping across the plains and you'll encounter some wolves and they kill you, which is really annoying. I haven't put that sort of thing specifically in the book, but because it kind of would, oh, all the characters are dead, chapter 5, never mind. No, we can't do that. That doesn't make for a good story. But you know, some of those elements, some of the stuff that you forget when playing the game, some of the places, you know, need to be kind of drawn out. That makes Lords of Midnight very distinct. Obviously there's the ice and the snow, which lends a completely different texture to the world. You know, the landscape is frozen solid, so it's a very different world from, you know, the lovely green fields of Hobbiton. So there's a lot there you can use to differentiate, and it's emphasising those particular aspects. The characters. So here's the next problem: the characters. We have quite a big cast. I can't remember how many it is, but it's a lot. And one of the big problems of it, in the way that Lords of Midnight plays, is that you've got an awful lot of the Lords of. So I'm trying to get these in the right order. I'll see if I do. I'll get the Lord of Guard, then we've got the Lord of Marrakith, then we've got the Lord of Zadjigith, and then we've got the Lord of Shimmerl, and we've got the Lord of no, I've got that wrong. There's number 5. I think Shimmerl's 5. The Lord of Kumar, Lord of Ithron, Lord of Derigrim, how you pronounce that, you know, Lord of Dreams, and so on and so forth. The Lord of, the Lord of, the Lord of, the Lord of, Lord Blood, you know, Lord of Mourning, Lord of Thrawn, Lord of Athril, Lord of it just goes on and on and on. Lord this, Lord that, and that's quite hard to manage as a story, because none of these guys have got real names, apart from one actually, as it turned out in the research. Lord Dreams does actually have a name. You can find that in the lore if you know where to look, but it will be in the book anyway. So there's a small one, but I don't kind of use it because most people won't be familiar with it for too much. So that is a thing. There are a few other characters in there. Obviously, our major 4 do have kind of first names, and we have the you know, the kind of wild card Utarg of Utarg, who's kind of this other chap towards the far east of the map, who lends a little bit of variety to it as well. And a few legends around him in terms of what the game was supposed to do with the Utarg. There's a couple of things in the manual that, if you know your Lords of Midnight lore, you'll be aware of Utarg and what he was potentially capable of doing. Turns out that code in the game was never written, but I've kind of looked at that and had a little bit of play with the possibilities there, because of course you can in the book. It, you know, allows you to stretch beyond the parameters of the game. So there is a big cast of characters. That's actually not ideal for writing a book, because what you really want to do is you want to focus down on the important ones and develop them as much as possible. So obviously I've done that with the main 4. So we delve quite a lot into Luxor and his background and who he is and why he is and what his reaction to becoming the Moon Prince is like. Morkin, as we know, is a young boy as this thing starts out, and you know, he's typical young lad, wants to make his mark, quite ambitious, quite impetuous, a bit reckless, all those kind of things. You have Corleth, and then we have the relationship, obviously because he's Fae, you've got the relationship between the Free and the Fae. Now in the game, the Fae aren't really all that different to the Free, other than they can move a bit faster in the forests and they wear different clothes. Other than that, they're kind of the same in terms of the capabilities in the game. But clearly I wanted to differentiate that a little bit, and I wanted to not make the Fae just elves in a different way. There had to be something a bit more distinct about them. So I've tried to differentiate that as well, to give the Fae a little bit more of a you know, a characterization all of their own. The other thing that's important there is that in the game, the Free and the Fae just kind of join up and off they go and fight Doomdark. That's a bit naff. from a storytelling perspective. So as the book starts out, the free and the fae are not really seeing eye to eye, and that's a dynamic in the book that I can use to exploit a bit of tension and kind of, you know, cause some scenes between the free and the fae, particularly as they get under stress, because obviously they come under attack. So that's, you know, trying to broaden and deepen what's going on behind the game as you're playing it, to kind of give those different races some input. Now there are a few other characters in there, and I've made sure that they're in the book and they have significant roles. So if you've played the game, you'll know of Forkrin the Skullquin, and you'll also know clearly of Doomdark. He's the evil baddie at the top of the map. And there's also another one, Farflame the Dragon Lord. And so we had a lot of fun trying to figure out exactly what to do with Farflame, and because he was an interesting character in the game, in terms of what he could do and his capabilities and so on and so forth. But, you know, why was there a dragon on his own in the realm of Midnight? There was only one dragon. Why was he there? So there has to be a reason for that character to be doing what he's doing. So we've tried to work on that and kind of wind back a little bit to explain where these characters came from, what they're doing. Only tantalizing hints in the first book, because we don't need to explain all of our thinking right now, but we have done some of that homework to make sure that these characters have some backstory and where they've come from. The other thing that we've done looking forward, and this one's potentially slightly controversial, and no spoilers, but I'll give you the kind of outline, is that we have looked forward to other books and other games. So Doomdark's Revenge, for example, happens pretty much chronologically straight after Lords of Midnight, and there are some characters in that book which clearly would have been around at the time of the events of Lords of Midnight. So the two obvious ones there are Tarathel the Fae and Shareth the Heartstealer. Now Tarathel is the daughter of the Lord of Dreams, and Shareth the Heartstealer is daughter of Doomdark himself, and she's the antagonist. Shareth is the antagonist in Doomdark's Revenge, and Tarathel plays a very important part in Doomdark's Revenge. But of course neither of those characters existed when Lords of Midnight was created as a game, and so clearly they don't appear. But it's impossible for them not to have been around during the time of Lords of Midnight if we're writing a story. So what we've done is we have alluded to these characters and given them some, you know, kind of backstory in Lords of Midnight to introduce them, so they don't just appear at the beginning of Doomdark's Revenge with no preamble at all. Because clearly, if we take Tarathel, she's the daughter of the Lord of the Dreams. One can only assume, and certainly in the novellas of Doomdark's Revenge, she is resident at the Citadel of Dreams. So she would have witnessed the events of Lords of Midnight from the Citadel of Dreams, probably had a view, you know, she was certainly there. So what was she doing during the time of Lords of Midnight? Well, the game doesn't tell us anything about that at all, so we've been at liberty to kind of work that out. So Tarathel does have a role to play in the story, because she would have been there, and that also allows us to segue into Doomdark's Revenge a little bit more smoothly than Tarathel just appearing out of nowhere and go, oh, she's a daughter of Lord of Midnight, where the hell was she? Yeah, we've had to kind of work things back from the other games into Lords of Midnight to make sure that we can actually bring them in if we do get to write the book of Doomdark's Revenge, which obviously I really much hope we do. So lots of things like that have had to be considered as we write Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, I keep saying that. God. Lords of Midnight. It's a really bad habit, isn't it? It's the whole Lord of things. That's what's killing me. So Lords of Midnight. I'm not writing the Lords of the Rings. Let's get that straight. So writing Lords of Midnight. So all those things have to be brought in. It's quite important to get that sort of stuff right dramatically and narratively, because otherwise, if the book is written, the book becomes lore, and I can't contradict myself in Doomdark's Revenge and think, I should have changed that. I need to think those sort of things through. And so Chris and I have been looking at this, and we've been quite tough on ourselves. Chris has pulled me up on a few things saying, no, we can't do that because of the Eye of the Moon lore, we can't do that because of events that happened over here. Here's a bit of backstory that Mike Singleton kind of penciled in, so we need to pay homage to that as well, and we can't contradict that in this, and so on and so forth. And it's quite complicated actually, so you have to write these things out very clearly. We've got these lore guides, we've got a lot of stuff that we've extracted from various places. So I have this lore document, which fascinating stuff actually, which obviously we can't give to you at the moment because it's kind of spoilers, but there's a lot of stuff in there that we've gone through, put in the right order. We've put in a timeline of events in Midnight and Ice Mark and Blood March, in order to make sure that we sequence things properly and make sense of things. And there's a lot of bits and pieces, like, for example, the Eye of the Moon, which is a game that never actually took place, unfortunately. But you know, we know the sort of outline of events that took place there, and things that Luxor and some of his compatriots have to do at that point in the story mean that we're constrained into certain things. So there's certain characters that unfortunately can't die because they're referenced canonically in later stuff. So you do know some of that, so you know, we can't break some of those kind of things, which does limit the story a little bit. And some people may say, well, you know, we know what the outcome is, what's the point of writing this thing? And I said, well, the journey is, I know it's a cliche, but the journey is kind of important. How do we get to, you know, the end of Lords of Midnight? We know what the ending is, and we've taken the canonical big ending, if you like, that's referred to in the Doomdark novellas. That you know, and you can read those if you want to. No point me spoiling it on video, but if you want to know what the ending is, it's obvious. We haven't diverged from that because it doesn't seem appropriate to do so. But getting there and how does it happen and all that kind of stuff is where we focused our attention, which is, you know, I think what most of you, I hope, will be expecting and enjoying to read. You know, it's familiar, you know the outcome, you know these people. What you're going to be able to do is get to know these characters, appreciate them, see their you know, see their shortcomings, see how they react under pressure, see what happens in battle, you know, join them on an epic quest where you know what they're trying to do, but you don't know the detail of all the events that happen. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. Lots of other bits and pieces in the game which are quite interesting. So, you know, for example, just remembered, number 4 is the Lord of Gloom. I'm glad I've just remembered that at that point in time, because he's quite important. Why the hell is he up in the top left corner of the map? We had to answer questions like that. You know, he's part of the Free, but he's sort of tucked in up there, right next to the evil bad guy. You know, there's a question. How does life carry on in Midnight when everything is frozen? So how do we feed all these armies of all these you know, all these warriors? How does that work? Why are there abandoned keeps in some of the places that don't have lords? What's happened there? How did Luxor become a Moon Prince? What was he doing before he became a Moon Prince? We don't really see any of that. So we've gone back a bit. We've wound back in the first chapter or so to kind of have a look at what was going on in Midnight before the events of the War of the Solstice actually began. You know, the encounter that Luxor and Morkin have with Rothron and Korlef, which is the start of the game, is subtly different in the book, to give you a little bit more insight into the sort of stuff that's going on in the background. So all of that, if you blend it all together, does make Lords of Midnight very distinct, I think, and hope. No, I'm pretty confident, to be honest. Very distinct from the Lord of the Rings. I think I've done enough, and obviously with Chris's enormous amount of help, to write a Lords of Midnight novel that A, does justice to the game, B, will be something that the fans of the game and will appreciate and go, yes, okay, here's someone who really played the game, loved the game, understood what the game was all about, got the essence of that game, put that into a story that you're hopefully going to enjoy reading. There's a respectful distance from Lord of the Rings, and I've also tried to write a book that if you're just wanting to read a fantasy book, you're going to enjoy it as well. So enough of the background and stuff is explained, not at length, but enough that people coming new to it will go, yeah, I can pick this up and I can enjoy it. My sort of litmus test on that is my wife. She never played Lords of Midnight at all, but read the book, thought it was a great story and really, really enjoyed it. So, you know, so that's good. She's quite she's quite a tough critic. She'd find a couple of plot holes as well, which she's also quite good at as well. So that was good. So so those I suppose are the sort of challenges, sort of considerations that I've had in writing Lord of the Rings. I've done it again. Lords of Midnight. I'm not writing Lords of the Rings. So this one has already been written. Yep. So yeah, so lots and lots of detailed consideration, a lot of thought and a lot of energy has gone into figuring out the lore, making it consistent, looking forward, looking back, bringing in all the stuff that's in the game that is significant, all the little bits that are interesting, you know, the locations of the lords, some of the names, some of the kind of attitudes of them. For example, some of the lords were more heroic than others, so some of them were useless when the ice sphere got stronger because they wouldn't attack anybody. So we've, you know, that gives you a small amount of characterization you can play with, and you can then use that and put that into the game, and to differentiate all the characters, because there is a, you know, there's a big vast thing. And then obviously keeping tallies of all the armies and trying to make sure that those battles are reflective of the way that the game works, and so on and so forth. So all that has been done. We've spent a lot of time working on that, in, you know, documenting it, encapsulating it, checking it, reviewing it, buzzing emails back and forth at all hours of the day, trying to make sure that we actually nail the essence of what's in there in this game, to make sure that the book is as good as it can possibly be. And I'm pretty confident, after all this time, and it's almost 2 years since we started, that we've actually got something really, really strong, really, really compelling. So I've read it through actually relatively recently to just do a kind of final typo check, and it was still grabbing me, and I know exactly what happened inside out, and I'm kind of getting sick to death of it at this point after 4 months of editing the damn thing. But it's, you know, I still enjoy reading it. So I think we've nailed it again. I'm very, very hopeful of it. And you know, if it's successful, great, because then we can get to go on to you know, to Doom Dark as well. So that would be fantastic. So I'm going to wrap up there. Potentially more videos to come, obviously, so stay tuned. I hope you're enjoying the series. If you've got any questions, obviously just dump them as comments on YouTube. You can Twitter me or Facebook me, very easy to find out where I am, and look forward to seeing you on the next one. So take care.